Today I'm going to be sewing the Cora Blouse with the Entredeux finish on the front. Entredeux is a heritage technique that can be used by using a wing needle in your sewing machine and the fancy stitches that you have got. So today for this I'm using my domestic machine because it has more finishes than my industrial. It's a good idea to experiment first. I'm using a cheesecloth for this because it's a fairly open weave and it allows the wing needle to make perforations between the fibres that create those little holes that you have in the heritage sewing. So I've tried a few different experiments. I'm going to be using on my machine number 27 down the front, which gives me a nice open pretty finish, and then for the neckline and hem and cuffs to finish off that seam I'm going to use number 12. So you can see I've had a bit of a play and made the direction that I'm going. In order to achieve a nice clean finish on your Entredeux sewing, it's a good idea to use something to stabilize the material behind. So I'm using tearaway here and I've cut strips. So these ones are 2 centimeters wide because I plan to do 2 rows down the front, and I have a slightly thicker one for doing the yoke seams. So here's the front of my Cora blouse. I have used an erasable marker. I've used this friction pen to draw on the seam lines for my Entredeux. Always check on a scrap that the pen will actually erase with heat. I've already done that experiment and I know that it will go away, so I'm okay with that. So I have drawn on the front seams and the yoke seam, and on the reverse I have drawn my darts. Now I'm not going to sew the darts first because I want to do all of my Entredeux before I construct the rest of the blouse. On your pattern you have one yoke and on each side of the centre front a single seam. So I'm going to start with these, but I've done a few experiments and I really like the Entredeux, so I'm actually going to do 2 rows on the front and possibly 4 on the top. So really experiment with your machine, see what stitches work best for you and make a decision based on that. So I'm going to slide it under the machine. I'm going to take a strip of my tearaway and I'm going to pop it underneath, and because it's such light fabric I can actually see where the tearaway is, and I'm starting with the seams that are parallel to the centre front. And I'm going to, having done my little experiments, I know I want stitch number 27, so I'm going to set my machine to number 27 and I'm going to start sewing. So it's really simple. You set your machine, you've got your wing needle in, and you literally just start sewing. As you're sewing, don't pull the material at all, just let your machine feed through as it needs to, and that's why using the stabilizer helps. It'll stop any threads from snapping or the fabric from bunching up. I can see the edge, so I've got about 1/2 centimetre on the side of my line, which means that I'm going to have enough as I head towards the middle to do a second row. As you can see, this is very slow work. And there is my stitching coming together. So I'm just going to pause the sewing and put it onto a little bit of a speed play so you don't have to watch this in real time because it will take a while, but that's the point of heritage stitching, is you get that vintage feel and you've taken the time to actually create something really beautiful. So here I've done 2 rows on each side of those parallel front seams. You saw me tearing off the tearaway on one side, and I'll just show you a little bit slower on this side. Something to make note of, on mine, on this side, the thread broke at the top. So that meant that I needed to tear away the tearaway and then replace it with another piece, because when I tried sewing with the tearaway that was already perforated, the stitching wouldn't work anymore. So it's really easy to do this. You literally just pull on it and it comes away from your stitching without pulling it at all. It's just fantastic. I've tried using tissue paper and it really doesn't work as well as this. And I just bought this online and had it delivered, which is how I like to get things done. And if you just cut it into strips, it actually isn't that uneconomical. Like so. So I've just torn that off. Now I'm ready to do the yoke stitching. So I have a wider piece for this because of the angle. So what I'm going to do is pop it on underneath the blouse front, making sure I've got enough space at the bottom, and I'm just going to put a pin in to hold it in place. And then on the side, making sure it's nice and flat and not stretched out, because cheesecloth obviously does stretch a bit because of the crinkle. And this time I'm going in the opposite direction, which could cause that crinkle to stretch out. So I'm not going to try and confine it. If it needs to do that, I'm going to let it, because I know that when I wash it, the crinkle will pull it all back in. So then this time I'm starting on the side, again following my line, and I'm going to stitch, I think 4 rows, we'll see, 4 rows along that yoke stitching line. Before I get started, I'm actually going to check on my bobbin, because the Entredeux uses a lot of thread and I just want to make sure that I've got enough. So I've probably got enough for 2 rows there, so I'm just going to have that in the back of my mind as I'm sewing. So when I started sewing, it actually, a bit of the fabric got caught underneath and the stitching got stuck, which caused the tearaway to perforate and bunch up a bit. So all I did was start from the other direction and come across, and it was fine. So now I'm going to do all of the stitching in the same direction in order to keep the fabric being pushed in the same direction as well. So I really liked the Entredeux stitching, so I'm actually going to keep going with it, and I'm going to do an edge around the neckline. I'll probably end up doing this on the hem and the sleeve edge as well. So I've chosen number 16, which is kind of like a blanket stitch on my machine, and I want to sort of make sure that the sort of blankety bit is coming out and then more of the straight bit is going over the bias binding. So I'll just start this off and we'll have a look as I go round. Because I have the bulk of the bias binding there, I don't need to use the tearaway paper. And you can see I'm getting that little decorative edge, so I'm just going to carry on with that. And that's done. Take that out. I think that looks really pretty. Also, just a little fitting trick with this. If you find that, say, your neckline does stretch, I'll show you a little example I did earlier. On this is a beautiful linen. I actually did rouleaus, sort of 1 centimetre wide rouleaus of cut on the cross, and then I stitched them on using a blanket stitch, creating rows. So that's actually 2 rows. And if I show you on the wrong side, you can see there's my bias binding strip sort of as a simulation of a finished neckline, and then the 2 rows of the rouleaus sewed on. And I really like that effect. So here we have the blouse after the paper has been torn off, and I've given it a press, and you can see the marker has fully disappeared with the ironing. I was careful to make sure that I didn't iron out the dart lines that I've drawn. And because I've used the same colour thread, the bit where I fixed up the skip stitching is absolutely fine. But if you were using a contrast colour thread, you would definitely be wanting to make sure that you perhaps undid it and then redid it, so you didn't have a messy patch. So now we get on to the actual construction of the blouse, which is pretty quick compared to the amount of time it takes to do that pretty Entredeux. So I'm going to sew the darts first. The way I like to sew my darts is to put a pin at the apex of the dart through a couple of millimeters. I fold the dart over, matching the little snip notches. Fold it in half and put a pin in about halfway. Then I just sew my dart, starting from the seam, little back tack, sewing up, remove that first pin, and by folding the dart in half and just sort of letting the pin create that apex, I just sew along until I get up to the pin, remove the pin, come straight off the fold, back tack and do a single stitch forward, then take it out. And you can see my dart is sewn beautifully. So now I'm going to do the other side in the same way, putting a pin through the apex, matching the notches on the side, putting that pin in, and I'm just going to sew that. Okay, so that's my 2 darts sewn, and I'm just going to press them so the dart faces down the body. So now we're going to sew the shoulder seams. So I have my back and my front. I put them together, right sides together, matching that shoulder seam, like so. And with my 1 centimetre seam allowance, I'm just going to sew across. Now, I'm using cheesecloth, which is a little bit stretchy because it's got the crinkle. So you just want to sort of pat things into place so that they match, because you know that from having cut them out that the pattern pieces do match, but fabric will move. Now I'm using a technique called chaining on. I like it because not only does it make the sewing quicker, I use less thread, and if you do as much sewing as me, you go through a lot of thread. So I've matched the other shoulder seams, and instead of taking the material out, I just lift the foot and carry on sewing. snip that out. Now I could cut the thread joining that neck point on the shoulder, but actually I'm just going to overlock straight across and then cut it because, well, it's just quicker and easier. So I've sewn the shoulder seam, overlocked it, and pressed the seam towards the back. Now I'm going to flip it to the right side and I'm ready to sew the neck. So the first thing I'm going to do is start from the center back. So I need to just mark that. I can either do a tiny notch and or just pop a pin into the center back like so. So you can either use bought bias binding or you can make your own. I quite like to make my own. So here I have some strips, which I think, actually that will go round I think, but if I wanted to, I could use shorter ones and simply join them together. And if I did that, I would be looking to make sure that the grain line goes in the same direction rather than flipping it over and having it in reverse. If you do need to join your seam, you match up the diagonal, fold it over, but don't match the points like this, because that means that when you actually do your sewing, it's going to be off center. So what you want to do is overlap so that where you're actually sewing meets those two edges. So I'll just show you how that looks so you can see. The seam allowance doesn't matter too much. I like to give myself a little bit extra so I can then cut it off. I just find it's easier to sew. But back tacking, sewing along the seam, take that out, and you can see that I have sewn from edge to edge, not point to point. I can then trim that seam allowance back and cut off the points. And I can give that a press open, but now if I open that out, you can see it's actually matched. But I think I'm going to be okay. So I'm going to open out my top and put it under my machine with the center back on top. I'm going to take my bias and I'm just going to cut the end so that it is straight. And I'm going to fold over a little seam allowance and I'm going to line that up with the center back. I'm going to pop that under the machine. Now if you were using bought bias binding, it would have fold lines in it. I don't bother with the fold lines if I make my own because I just use my own seam allowance. So I'm going to sew along with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I've just back tacked to hold that in place. I'm going to line up my bias binding now. I'm being very careful not to stretch the bias binding. I could have made my bias binding a bit narrower and we'll see how it goes, but what I find is that sometimes when you make your own, depending on the kind of material, say a silk chiffon, it can really stretch. So by making it a little bit wider than I need, it means that I can then just trim it back to the width that I want. So I'm coming over the shoulder, making sure the seam is nice and flat, rounding the bias binding over that shoulder into the front neck curve. Sewing along. Oh, too much bias binding. Up to that shoulder, making sure that the seam is still pressing towards the back, curving the bias around, coming up to the center back, and now I just want it to overlap that little seam that I did, so I'm just going to cut that off like so and complete the seam and take that out. So I've sewn all the way around the neck. Now instead of just taking that off and pressing it, what I'm going to do is keep it flat, so my seam allowance is facing towards the right, and I'm going to fold the bias binding over so it's on top of that seam allowance, and I'm going to edge stitch, so that's about 2 millimeters from the seam, all the way around my bias binding. And as I sew, I'm just using my fingers to pull on each side of the seam, so not stretching it that way, I'm just pulling it from side to side to prevent any kind of folding or buckling happening, and just sewing around in that circle. The way you use your hands when you sew is really important. It can make life easier or harder, so maybe just watch my hands as well. I might forget to mention something, but the muscle memory of my hands will show you what I'm doing as well. Snip the threads and take it out. So now I've got my bias binding partly sewn. You can see that little folded edge that we had underneath is creating a nice join. I don't need to sew that down because the bias binding is quite narrow anyway. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to get my duckbill scissors and I'm going to trim the seam allowance back like so. So the duckbill scissors aren't necessary, but what they do is they actually help preventing you from cutting through all the layers. But the trick is to cut with the seam this way up. It's tempting to go the other way, but in fact this way you are less likely to actually cut through your bias binding, and also it is protecting the front of the blouse, because if you did cut through the bias binding, that's not really such a big deal, but you don't want to cut through the front of your blouse, because then that would mean redoing the whole thing or finding some cunning way to make a design feature of a unwanted hole. Cutting, trimming off down to about 3 millimeters from the seam. All the way around. So now you can see that's trimmed back nicely, and now I can look at my bias binding. So I'm going to fold the seam allowance towards the seam that I've already sewn and fold that over, and that's quite a thick binding seam that I would prefer to have something a little bit more delicate. So now I can actually just go back and trim my binding. I'm going to take about 1/2 centimetre off all the way around so that I've got a narrower seam. If your material doesn't have very much give, it can be easier to have a narrow binding around the edge. With an open weave like this, it wouldn't really matter. It's more of an aesthetic thing. So trimming that off, coming back to the centre back and matching, like so. And now I'm going to start again from the centre back. I'm going to fold the seam allowance over towards the seam and then the whole of the binding over, so you can see that's quite a bit narrower now. You might be tempted to give that an iron first, and you know, I'm not one to say that there are particular right and wrong ways of doing things, but I just find that you don't need to, that trust yourself. The trick is so I'm using the foot to hold down the material rather than a pin. I'm coming about 10 centimeters up, folding the seam over. So the seam allowance is at the seam, it's over, and then I just use my nail to tuck that under. And I didn't back tack at the start there because I'm going to over sew. So turning over, matching the seam allowance to the seam and folding, and just easing that around the curve. So I just do that all the way around, and I just use my fingernail to slide under the seam, and it just slots into place nice and easily. And I'm sewing right on the edge of the bias binding to give me that nice narrow seam. And you know, as you go around parts of the curve, the binding will stretch more than others, so what you want to do is just monitor it and check that you're getting a nice even bias binding seam. And again, because I'm using cheesecloth and it's got this crinkle, I really don't want to stretch the actual body of the blouse as I'm sewing, so you want to be really careful about that. With fabrics that don't have a crinkle in, it's not such an issue. Around the shoulder. Coming back to the home stretch towards the centre back. The other reason I like to start with the centre back is because if you're not putting a label in, you can quickly see, because of the seam, where that centre back is. Okay, so if you look at this from the right side, you can see I've got a nice narrow seam. There's the stitching, and on the inside you can see the bias binding. So now I'm going to give that a press. So I really liked the Entredeux stitching, so I'm actually going to keep going with it, and I'm going to do an edge around the neckline. I'll probably end up doing this on the hem and the sleeve edge as well. So I've chosen number 16, which is kind of like a blanket stitch on my machine, and I want to sort of make sure that the sort of blankety bit is coming out and then more of the straight bit is going over the bias binding. So I'll just start this off and we'll have a look as I go around. Because I have the bulk of the bias binding there, I don't need to use the tearaway paper, and you can see I'm getting that little decorative edge, so I'm just going to carry on with that. And that's done. I'll take that out. I think that looks really pretty. Also, just a little fitting trick with this. If you find that, say, your neckline does stretch, I'll show you a little example I did earlier. On this is a beautiful linen. I actually did rouleaus, sort of 1 centimetre wide rouleaus of cut on the cross, and then I stitched them on using a blanket stitch, creating rows. So that's actually 2 rows, and if I show you on the wrong side, you can see there's my bias binding strip sort of as a simulation of a finished neckline, and then the 2 rows of the rouleaus sewed on, and I really like that effect. I've given that neckline a press again, doing the Entredeux around the neck, really stretched it out, but I just used loads of steam, fogged up my glasses, and I've shrunk it all back. So that was absolutely fine. Now I'm ready to sew the side seam. So I'm going to open out the top and fold it back together, right sides together, like so. And I'm going to sew down one side and back up the other. So matching under the arms, my 1 centimetre seam allowance, little back tack, sewing along, taking the edges and matching them up. Sewing down to the bottom, and again I'm going to chain on. So this time starting from the bottom and going towards the top. matching the sides. Just going to snip that join just to make it easier to open out the top. Matching the armhole. When I get to that dart, I'm just going to make sure that it's facing towards the hem, coming up, and back tacking. Now that is ready to have the side seams overlocked, but as I said, I like to try and make my sewing quite quick and efficient. So now I'm going to take my sleeves, I'm just going to push that to one side, open out my pair of sleeves and fold them right sides together. So take the top one and fold it in half, flip it over, take the other side and fold it in half. That way I know that I've got a pair rather than two in the same direction, because it can be tricky to tell when your fabric is the same on both sides. But I want to make sure that my notches are in a pair for the front and back. So I'm going to sew down the inseam of the sleeve. So back tacking at the top, matching the ends, and sew all the way down, and this time I'm going to sew from the bottom to the top. Matching the underarm of the sleeve and just pulling that so that it just snaps into position. Up to the armhole, back tack, and take the fabric out. Now I'm going to overlock these. So with this method I'm using a set-in sleeve, but if you preferred you could certainly skip doing that side seam, sew the head of the sleeve into the blouse, and then do the side seam and inseam of the sleeve all in one go. There's not a right and wrong way to doing this, just a matter of preference. Now I'm going to set in the sleeves. So I've overlocked the seam allowance on the sleeves and the side seams, and I've pressed them towards the back. Now I'm leaving the blouse part inside out and through the neck, opening out the armhole. I've turned the sleeves to be the right way out, like so. And I'm going to just match the notches. So there's my double notch there for the back, double notch on the blouse for the back, my underarm. So I'm going to pop a pin in there. I've got then the notch for the top of the sleeve head, and I fold that to the inside. So that's the inside shoulder seam to the sleeve, like so. And put a pin in there at the top of the sleeve head and the shoulder, and then I bring that around and I can see that my notches for the back are matching, and at the front my notches there are matching. So I like to start sewing under the arm, but I start slightly off from the seam so that I get a really nice curve under the arm. So I'm going to start about an inch from the side seam. So that goes under the machine. Back tack, that thread out of the way, coming around. I don't put pins in around the sleeve. I find it much harder to set in a sleeve with loads of pins. You'll notice that I actually don't use heaps of pins, because I find that they're more of a hindrance most of the time. Sewing around, making sure the notch is matching, coming around. And now with this top of the sleeve head, I've got this, I'm sewing with the sleeve on top of the body of the blouse. I'm able to just ease that in as I sew around, like so. Take the pin out of the shoulder, roll the material around, easing the material around that shoulder, making sure my notches are matching. So I might just pop a pin in there, because I know that that's an exact measure, and it's this sleeve head that requires a little bit of easing so it sits beautifully over the shoulder. Coming around, take that pin out. Never sew over your pins, it can cause your needles to get little jags in them which can pull on the material. To me, sewing is a bit like braille. You use your fingers to feel what's going on, so just check to feel that there's no pleating underneath. Coming along, finishing that seam, snipping the threads, and then from that shoulder side you can see there's no tucking, and on the sleeve it's just gently eased in around that top of the shoulder head beautifully. Okay, so now I'm going to do the other side. I will then overlock the seam and get back to you. Now we're nearly there. The first thing I'm going to do is sew the hem. So I'm just going to, this is the right way out, open it out, and I'm just going to turn it over 1 centimetre and 1 centimetre just for a nice neat little hem. I could overlock it and just turn it up, that would be fine, but I think in this cheesecloth it's good to do a double hem. I think it just looks prettier. So what I do is I just measure out sort of about 10 or 15 centimetres, do a double turn, pinch it with my finger and forefinger, and then just slide my nail in to tuck the material under. If you use this technique, you'll find that your hems don't twist. If I was to keep going like this and going and pulling, I can really end up twisting my hem, and you really want to avoid that. So this trick, sort of coming about 10 centimetres down, doing your double turn, even if it was a single turn, it works the same. Then giving it a little pull, using your nail just to tuck that under, you get this really neat little hem. That's a really good trick. I use this all the time. And carry on going the whole way around. And then you can use your side seams as a marker too, just to check that you haven't actually twisted. It's a good point to just reassess what's going on. Coming around, snap it into position. Again, with your little entredeux, that's a good position to just check the seam's not twisted. And you know, it's up to you. You can make this hem 2 centimetres or 4, whatever suits you. A good way of shortening it is just make a deeper hem. A deeper hem looks really nice as well, depending on how also you want to wear your blouse. Remember, you're the designer. Coming to the end, back tack and take it out. Snip those threads. Like so. Now I could just leave that as it is, but I really like the effect of the entredeux on the neckline, so I'm going to do that around the hem as well. Okay, so I've done my little bit of entredeux around the hem, and I think that looks really pretty. Just remember, if you are doing it the same stitch as you did around the neckline, you need to actually reverse it. So I had to sew mine that way under the machine in order to get my little blanket stitch coming out. So just don't make the mistake that I did and sew it back to front initially. Now we're going to sew the cuffs for the sleeve. There are 3 options that you can do. You can simply hem the sleeve, and you could do a single turn like we did on the hem, or you could make it a single turn and then 4 centimetres so that you get a deeper hem, and that would look really pretty then to do the entredeux around the edge as well if you weren't going to elasticate it. For this one I'm going to do wide elastic, so I've got some elastic here. I've cut this to 30 centimetres, so if I join that with an overlap and put that over my arm, it's quite loose because I want this to look slightly gathered but not to actually grab onto my arm, because I just find that annoying. So for 30 centimetres for me works nicely. It's something that can move as I move my arms and lift my arms up and down. So I'm suggesting that you use a 4 centimetre elastic, like so. But, oh, sorry, I keep hitting my light there. But remember, elastic is 3-dimensional, so it's actually got this little edge which measures maybe 1 millimetre or 2. But what that means is if I was to make a channel that was exactly 4 centimetres, it would be a bit tight for the elastic. So I like to just give myself an extra 0.5 to do the channel. So instead of it being 4 centimetres, I'll make it 4.5. And because that's quite a bit to turn up, I like to actually just draw on the seam allowance. Now again, I'm using my erasable pen. So if my elastic channel needs to be 4.5 and then I've got a little 1 centimetre turnover, my total measurement is 5.5. So I'm going to draw that onto the top on both sides of the cuff, marking the measurement, drawing the line like so. Elastic. Then I'm going to turn over and just put a pin to hold the turn in place along that drawn line. Just snap it so it's in place like that. I don't need to use any more pins. Then I'm going to start from where that seam is. So I'm going to turn it under 1 centimetre. Do a little back tack. And turn under 1 centimetre. And I'm using that drawn edge as my guide. So again, you can see I don't need to use loads of pins because I have that drawn line instead. Sewing along or around. My machine's an industrial machine, so I can't remove the bed, but if your machine has the bit that you can slide out and you can sew around, you know, use the method that works best for you. Now I'm coming up to the start again and I need to leave an opening to thread the elastic through. So I'm going to take that out and I've left a gap of, I don't know, 3 centimetres or so. Take those pins out, trim off the elastic, and I'm going to get my nifty little tool for threading elastic. You could use a safety pin as well. This is just really good. So that's on. And slide it through the hole into the channel and thread it all the way through. Be a bit sticky just to get started. Be careful when you're threading it through as well that you don't accidentally pull it and then pull the whole thing in again. And you have to pull it all out and start again. So sliding that along. And I want to leave sort of about that much elastic so I can sew the elastic closed. So threading that. Bring the tool out through the opening. Now I want to just make sure that I don't twist the elastic, so I'm trying to keep it flat. So if I shuffle the gathers around so that I can see that my elastic is flat and I haven't twisted it at all. Take the tool off and then I'm going to overlap by about 1.5 centimetres. And now that I've actually sort of established that, I can give that a bit more of a pull because I know it's not twisted. I'm doing that. And I'm just going to sew the elastic close. So I'm actually going to sew an end shape. So down, the reverse will come up on the diagonal and then down again. So down, reverse, forward, and back tack, and bring that out and trim the threads. So you can see that kind of little N. Now I'm going to shuffle that into the channel. Just gently sliding the elastic around and then just sort of easing it into that opening like so. Now I don't want to bring the gathers right round yet because now I just need to sew that channel closed, but can you see how the elastic, so I allowed 4.5 centimeters, but because of that rolling over the top of the elastic, it actually looks really snug now, whereas if I'd made that exactly 4 centimeters, that would have been tight and possibly pulling on the elastic. So now I'm going to sew the little opening closed. And when I do this, I'm being very careful not to actually catch the elastic. And again, that's another reason for just giving yourself that extra couple of millimeters for controlling where the elastic goes. I'm trimming the threads. Now that the opening is closed, I can just pull the elastic and sort of ping it around so that the gathers are going to sit in place, and that gives me just a really gentle gathering and a wide cuff, which I really like. Because it's wide elastic, it could twist when I'm taking the garment off and on. So what I like to do is just a little bit of ditch stitching in that seam to hold the elastic in place. Like so. And now I'm ready to do the other side and give it a press. I've given the cuffs a press, so you can see that's just a really gentle gather. If I wanted more gathering, I could certainly make the elastic tighter. And my blouse with Entredeux is finished. Just want to show you another one that I made. So this one's in a linen, and I used a different sewing machine to try and do the Entredeux, and this is before I was using the tearaway as well, and it has quite a different effect. So the stitching itself isn't as perfect, but I actually liked how it turned out. So just know that sometimes what is not right in the strict sense of the word doesn't mean that it's actually wrong, and you might find that you come up with something that you like even better. So that's what happened on this linen one, and I got so carried away with it that I actually did 3 rows down the center of the sleeve, and this one just has narrow elastic in the cuff, and I did Entredeux around the edges as well, which was a little bit tricky when I sort of came to where the opening was with the elastic join, but it worked fine. So you can see, depending on the material that you use and the sewing machine that you use, you can get different results, and they are all just perfect. I finished Cora Blouse. Here it is with its pretty Entredeux stitching, a little bit around the neckline and the hem. Got the wide elastic cuffs, and because I've used the wide elastic, they're a little bit shorter than they would be with the narrow elastic. But you know, you can mix and match that. You can add lengths to your sleeves if you want to as well. You could make the elastic tighter if you wanted more gathers. I like them like this because it gives me full range of movement with my arms. So you can wear your top either out like this. I quite like a French tuck where you just, on about sort of that 3/4 hip angle, push in a little bit into your waistband and have that sitting out a little bit, and that's just a nice relaxed way of wearing it. You might also like to tie a knot in it, so you can just pull it up, twist it into a knot like so, and just have that as a kind of relaxed gathers. So what I really want to show you though is the difference that fabrics can make. So this is a cheesecloth, it's got a crinkle in it, it's soft, and it's sort of a little bit drapey. So it fits nicely to my body. I sort of don't feel too bulky in it. Using linens is a beautiful fabric for Entredeux, but depending on what you use, it can feel a little bit bubbly. So I'm going to show you the other one on so you can see the difference the fabrics make because it's the same size. Okay, this is the linen version. I thought this was beautiful linen. I do still really like it, but the grain line was all over the place. It was really hard to cut out, and then when I was sewing it, it kind of caused the entredeux to move a little bit. I've decided that's the character of this blouse, and I'm just going with it. You can see the sleeves are a bit longer because I used the narrow elastic but didn't alter the sleeve length, so they appear to be a bit longer. But you can also see how this one is kind of sitting away from my body where the other one draped a little bit more. So just be aware of that when you're selecting fabrics for making your clothing, that irregardless of the size, the actual material choice will make a difference to the final garment, irregardless of size. Have fun with your experimenting. Please share your makes with me at Pattern Union because I just love to see what you all do. Have fun.